Welcome back to Experience Points, a show in which I talk about games that I'm playing through but haven't yet completed in order to give you a better idea as to whether or not I think this game is worth your time. And today I'm going to be talking about a game that attempts to answer the age-old question, what if Zelda was a girl? The game that I'm talking about is Blossom Tales: The Sleeping King, a game that was made by Castle Pixel and is being published by FDG Entertainment, which is currently available on Nintendo Switch and Steam. In Blossom Tales, you play as a knight initiate to the Knights of Rose, and she is attempting to bring the Sleeping King. Basically, there was a king that got put under a sleeping spell by an evil magician, and it's up to her to try to figure out how to bring him back. So Blossom Tales: The Sleeping King is kind of a gender role reversal of most typical Zelda games that you've probably played in the past. Instead of playing as Link, who's off to save a princess, you are out trying to save the king, who has been put under a magical sleeping spell that keeps him from, well, I guess being awake to be a king. You've been brought in to the Knights of Rose recently. You're an initiate, but it seems like you're still the only person who's capable of figuring out some of these crazy puzzles that the game has to throw at you. I hate the term Zelda clone. I've mentioned this a little bit before because I feel like it gets thrown around a little bit too often. It gets applied to basically every action-adventure / action RPG game that ever existed, and, well, I'm gonna have to go ahead and call this a Zelda clone because that's exactly what this is. An unabashed Zelda clone. A really good Zelda clone, in fact. It actually plays a lot like, in my opinion, Minish Cap. It actually doesn't look too far from that, actually. It actually feels quite a lot like Minish Cap now that I think about it, which is actually really great because I really enjoy Minish Cap. So being able to play this with that kind of throwback style is really awesome, and it will feel really familiar to fans of the Zelda series. However, I think it should be noted that I don't recommend that you play this game with the Joy-Cons. Unfortunately, that's all I've got right now, but I feel like playing the game with an authentic D-pad would probably feel so much better and so much more natural for people who are playing through the game. It definitely has that feel of like an old 16-bit pedigree, and it's definitely the 16-bit Zelda that it's trying to imitate, not the 8-bit Zelda, which is still good, but 16-bit Zelda is, in my opinion, that's just kind of what stuck with me the most throughout my years. Obviously, I talked about the games that shaped me, and Link to the Past was definitely one of those. So playing this game as a throwback to that game, and also probably to Minish Cap, feels really refreshing, you know? I feel like I've recentered. So Blossom's out trying to break this curse that's been placed on the king, and so are the rest of the Knights of Rose who you will encounter on your travels. Some of them aren't exactly very bright, which is kind of funny. The game actually has a lot of humor to it. I don't think it's a parody because it's not trying to make fun of the Zelda series, though it does have a lot of humor built into the game. It's essentially a really interesting retelling of a tale by a grandfather to his grandchildren, who are also interacting with the story as it gets told. You know, it kind of reminds me a little bit of The Princess Bride, in fact. Every once in a while, Fred Savage would chime in, but Grandpa, that's not the way it could have gone. And the grandma's like, oh, okay, well, maybe it went this way. And it has a lot of that sort of dynamic to it as it's playing the game. And he's not just telling it to one grandson, he's telling it to a grandson and a granddaughter who both bicker and argue about the way that the story goes, which is interesting because it actually, at that point, presents you with a choice as the grandfather telling the story as to which child you will go with in this particular version of the story. So it's kind of unique in that sense, in that you can actually control sometimes what kind of enemies you'll be fighting or what kind of boss you'll be fighting. It's pretty cool. There are actually quite a few puzzles in the game, and I really like them. Very few so far have actually been the classic Zelda Sokoban style push block kind of puzzles. The game has actually kind of a mix of different kinds of puzzles, like lighting a bunch of torches with shooting arrows through flaming torches to kind of unlock areas and burned down foliage and such. And I really like that it's got those throwback sort of puzzles, but it also introduces a lot of new things that Zelda hasn't done, at least to my knowledge, including a lot of games that feel kind of like Simon Says, the memory game, if you're familiar with what I'm talking about, which is unfortunate for me because I suck at those kinds of games, but I feel like they're really fun to play, and I feel like that was a welcome addition, and it actually fits really well with the Zelda style of gameplay. That said, I feel like the Simon Says puzzles were pretty difficult. I think they went a little too long and ended up, well, I ended up having to cheat a little bit by writing down the patterns as they went. I feel like the graphics of the game look really good. I don't necessarily feel like they look authentic to actual 16-bit. I feel like there's a lot of motion to the screen that isn't on a pixel by pixel basis. It's not exactly faithful 16-bit. It's more of that stylized indie 16-bit that we see a lot of, which is not bad, but I probably would have preferred to have like a more authentic 16-bit mode if possible. The game does give you some options as far as like the screen shake and the way that it can follow around you when you're moving around on screen. You can switch between normal amounts of window movement and limited amounts. I feel like overall it was a really pretty looking game, regardless of whether or not it was true 16-bit, you know what I mean? And musically, everything was pretty good. Nothing really stood out as a major track to me, but you know, it was pretty inoffensive, stayed in the background, and fit with everything that was going on pretty well. So the game is about 15 hours long and costs about $15 on Steam and on the Nintendo eShop. And from what I've played of it so far, the game actually feels really solid, and I think for 15 bucks, that's pretty good. And honestly, if the game ever gets a physical release, and I kind of hope it does, I definitely will be picking up a copy of it. But anyways, guys, I gotta chop this down, make it sound reasonable, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good day, everyone.